The air was cool and refreshing that afternoon in Greenwood Park. The rustling leaves and the faint chatter of families enjoying their picnics made it seem like any other peaceful day. But by the fountain near the playground, peace was the last thing on anyone's mind. "Let go of me! I didn't do anything!" screamed Tasha, her small voice cracking as she struggled against the firm grip of Officer Carter. The 9-year-old's brown braids swung wildly as she twisted and turned, her sneakers scraping against the pavement. Tears streamed down her face, but Carter's grip only tightened. "Stop squirming!" Carter barked, his face red with exertion. "You don't get to talk back, you little—" "Let her go!" yelled Miss Helen, her frail body trembling with a mix of fear and fury. She hobbled closer with her cane, her free hand outstretched toward her granddaughter. "She's just a child! She ain't done nothing wrong!" Carter shot her a glare. "Back off, ma'am, or you'll be next. You already dragged me out of my seat. You done shoved me down once. You think I'm scared of you now?" Miss Helen's voice was strong, but her grip on the cane betrayed how unsteady she felt. Her 72-year-old frame wasn't built for confrontations, but there was no way she'd let these officers hurt her granddaughter without a fight. Behind her, a small crowd began to gather. A jogger slowed down, pulling out her phone. A young man whispered to his friend, "What the hell's going on?" Another woman held her toddler's hand tightly, unsure whether to intervene or move away. The murmurs rose as Officer Blake, Carter's burly partner, stepped forward. He didn't bother hiding his disgust. "This little brat matches the description we got. That's all the reason we need." He turned to Miss Helen. "And you need to keep that mouth shut before you find yourself in a jail cell." "Description of what?" Miss Helen demanded. "She's a child. What crime could she possibly have committed?" Blake ignored her. "Carter, put the cuffs on her. Kids like her need to learn early." The words sent a jolt through the crowd. A woman gasped audibly. "You're really cuffing a kid!" "Someone call for help," another voice said, but no one stepped forward. Carter reached for the handcuffs on his belt. Tasha's cries grew louder, her tiny arms trying to push him away. "Stop it! Grandma! Help me!" she wailed, her voice breaking in panic. Her cries only seemed to encourage Carter, who yanked her arm roughly, causing her to stumble. Miss Helen couldn't take it anymore. She swung her cane, striking Carter's shoulder. "Get your filthy hands off her!" she yelled, her voice trembling with rage. Carter stumbled back, momentarily stunned. Blake stepped in immediately, shoving Miss Helen so hard she fell backward onto the pavement with a sickening thud. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Miss Helen groaned, clutching her hip. "Enough of this crap!" Blake bellowed. "Get her in cuffs, Carter, now!" That was when Mike Tyson appeared. He'd been walking along the park's main path, hands tucked into the pockets of his gray hoodie, trying to clear his mind after a grueling training session. The commotion caught his attention from a distance. The raised voices, the unmistakable tension in the air. His sharp eyes zeroed in on the scene, and what he saw made his blood boil. Miss Helen lay sprawled on the ground, clutching her hip in pain, while Tasha screamed for her grandmother, struggling against the much larger officer who was manhandling her like a criminal. The officer's expressions weren't just harsh. They were downright hostile. Mike's fists clenched instinctively. He hadn't been in the ring for years, but the fire that made him a legend burned just as fiercely. He quickened his pace, weaving through the growing crowd. When he was close enough to hear Carter muttering threats under his breath, Mike's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" The crowd parted as heads turned toward the unmistakable figure. Some people whispered his name in surprise. Others froze, too shocked to process that the man walking toward the officers with a look of pure determination was the same Mike Tyson who had once ruled the world of boxing. Blake turned first, his brow furrowed. "Who the hell are you?" he snapped, sizing up the man approaching them. Mike ignored the question, his eyes fixed on Tasha, who had stopped struggling for a moment to stare at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. He turned his attention to Miss Helen, still groaning on the ground. "What did they do to you?" Mike asked gently, crouching beside her. Before she could answer, Carter stepped forward, his chest puffed out. "Back off, buddy. This doesn't concern you." Mike rose slowly to his full height, his piercing gaze locking onto Carter. It concerns me when I see two grown men abusing a little girl and her grandmother. Blake snorted. You need to mind your own business before this becomes your problem, too. Mike took a step closer, his voice calm, but laced with steel. You think you're tough, picking on a little girl? Shoving an old woman? Let her go, now. Carter scoffed, glancing at Blake. This guy thinks he's some kind of hero. Blake chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, and who's he supposed to be, huh? Batman? Someone in the crowd murmured, That's Mike Tyson. Blake's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. I don't care who you are, he said, his tone defiant. Step back, or we'll haul you in too. Mike's jaw tightened. He stepped between Tasha and the officers, shielding her with his body. You want to haul someone in? Try me. For a moment, no one moved. The tension was so thick it felt like the whole park was holding its breath. Carter's hand hovered near his baton, his eyes darting nervously between Mike and the crowd. You don't want to do this, Mike warned, his voice low. Not here, not in front of all these people. The crowd, encouraged by Mike's presence, began to murmur louder. Let her go, someone shouted. Another voice chimed in. We're recording everything. Blake's face twisted in anger. Carter, grab the kid, and let's go. Mike's hand shot out, gripping Carter's wrist before he could touch Tasha again. The move was so fast that Carter didn't have time to react. Mike's grip was like iron. Let her go. Mike's voice was deadly calm. Carter tried to yank his arm free, but Mike didn't budge. Blake stepped forward, his hand going to his baton. I'm warning you, man. Mike turned his gaze to Blake, his eyes cold and unyielding. Don't. Blake hesitated, his confidence wavering. Carter, still struggling in Mike's grip, growled. You're obstructing law enforcement. That's a crime. Mike finally released Carter's wrist, taking a step back. You're the criminals here, he said, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. And the whole world's about to know it. Blake's face turned red as he looked around, noticing the growing number of phones pointed in their direction. This isn't over, he muttered, though it was clear his bravado was crumbling. Mike turned back to Tasha and knelt. Are you okay, sweetheart? Tasha nodded shakily, tears still streaming down her face. She clung to Mike like a lifeline. Miss Helen, with the help of a kind bystander, managed to sit up. She looked at Mike with gratitude and disbelief. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for stepping in. Mike offered her a small, reassuring smile before turning his attention back to the officers, his expression hardening once more. Now, he said, his voice firm, you're gonna walk away before this gets even worse for you. As the officers retreated, grumbling under their breath, the atmosphere in Greenwood Park changed. Phones were still recording. Whispers still carried over the air, but all eyes were on the towering figure of Mike Tyson. He crouched down again to check on Miss Helen. Ma'am, can you stand? He asked, his voice much softer now. Miss Helen winced, shaking her head. I think my hip's busted, she said, her hand trembling as she reached out for support. I'm too old to be thrown around like a sack of potatoes. Don't worry, I'll get you some help, Mike assured her. He turned to the crowd and gestured toward a young man in a hoodie who had been recording the whole time. You, call an ambulance. The young man nodded quickly, pulling out his phone and stepping away to make the call. Mike's focus shifted to Tasha, who was still clinging to his side. You okay, kid? He asked, brushing a tear from her cheek. Tasha nodded hesitantly, but didn't say a word. Her small body was still trembling, her wide eyes darting toward the officers retreating toward their squad car. Mike's eyes narrowed. It's okay, he said gently. They're not coming back. Not while I'm here. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A woman in a floral dress stepped forward, her phone still recording. That was unbelievable. They were about to arrest a child. You saved her. Damn right he did, said a man in a leather jacket, folding his arms. But what about those cops? They can't just get away with this. Mike straightened, turning to face the crowd. They won't, he said firmly. Not if we do something about it. What can we do? Someone asked. Every single one of you who recorded what happened. Don't just sit on it. Post it. Share it. Send it to the news. Make sure people see what those officers tried to do here." His voice carried authority, but it wasn't angry. It was determined. The crowd nodded in agreement, encouraged by his words. Several people started reviewing their footage, others typing furiously on their phones. But as people began to disperse, a new scenario unfolded. From the far side of the park, a sleek black unmarked SUV pulled up next to the retreating squad car. Two men stepped out, both wearing dark suits and sunglasses. They moved with purpose, their expressions unreadable. "Who the hell are these guys?" someone in the crowd muttered. Mike's instincts kicked in immediately. These weren't regular cops, and their presence felt off. He stood protectively in front of Miss Helen and Tasha, his muscles tensing as the men approached. One of the men was tall and broad-shouldered. He pulled out a badge and held it up. "Federal agents," he announced curtly. "We need to speak to Mr. Tyson." Mike didn't flinch. "About what?" "About what just happened here," the agent replied, his tone clipped. "And about your involvement." The crowd stirred uneasily, but no one dared to speak up. Mike's jaw tightened. He wasn't in the mood for bureaucratic games, especially not after what he'd just witnessed. "You got something to say to me?" Mike said, stepping forward, his voice low but firm. "Say it here, in front of everybody." The agent's partner, a wiry man with sharp features, frowned. "This isn't the place for this discussion. We'd prefer if you came with us." Mike let out a short, humorless laugh. "Not happening. Whatever you've got to say, we're saying it right here. Unless you're planning to throw me in the back of a car like they tried to do to that little girl." The taller agent exchanged a glance with his partner. It was clear they hadn't expected resistance, least of all from someone as high-profile as Mike Tyson. "This doesn't have to become an issue," the lean agent said carefully. "We're just here to ask some questions." Mike crossed his arms, his imposing frame seeming to grow larger. "Then ask." The taller agent cleared his throat, glancing uneasily at the crowd still lingering nearby. "We've been monitoring tensions in this area for some time. Incidents like this," he gestured vaguely toward the squad car, "can complicate things." Mike raised an eyebrow. Complicated things for who? The people those cops were harassing? Or the people who finally stood up to them? The agent ignored the question. "We're asking you to be mindful of how your actions might escalate situations like this. Your presence here today, it's already drawing a lot of attention." Mike stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "Good. Maybe it's about time somebody paid attention to what's really going on." The lean agent stood calmly, but his partner held up a hand, signaling him to stand down. "We're not here to antagonize you, Mr. Tyson. Just tread carefully. That's all." Mike didn't respond immediately. He just stared at them with his eyes locked on the agents. Finally, he nodded sharply. "If you're done, I've got people to take care of." Without waiting for a reply, he turned his back on the agents and knelt beside Miss Helen again. "The ambulance is on its way," he said gently. "They'll take care of you." By the time the ambulance arrived, the video of the incident had already gone viral. Clips flooded social media, showing everything from Carter grabbing Tasha to Mike stepping in. The hashtags #Justice for Tasha and #Tyson. The protector began trending within hours. News outlets picked up the story, plastering Mike's face across their headlines. "Mike Tyson stops police confrontation in Greenwood Park." "Boxing legend steps in to protect child and elderly woman." The footage sparked outrage across the country, reigniting debates about police conduct and the abuse of authority. Back in Greenwood Park, Mike stood by as paramedics carefully lifted Miss Helen onto a stretcher. "You're going to be fine," he told her. "I'll make sure of it." She reached out and grasped his hand weakly. "You're a good man," she said softly. "I don't care what anybody says about you." Her words hit Mike harder than any punch he'd ever taken. He squeezed her hand gently, then stepped back as the paramedics closed the ambulance doors. As the ambulance pulled away and the crowd began to thin, Mike finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The agents were still lingering near their SUV, talking in low voices. The squad car was gone, but Mike knew those officers would resurface eventually, probably with some flimsy excuse for their actions. And then there was the question of the system that had allowed this to happen in the first place. Mike's fists clenched at his sides. He hadn't come to the park looking for trouble, but now that trouble had found him, he wasn't about to back down. Not when people like Tasha and Miss Helen were counting on him. He glanced down at Tasha, who was standing quietly beside him, her small hand clutching the hem of his hoodie. "You hungry, kid?" he asked, his voice softening. She nodded hesitantly. "A little." "Come on," he said, holding out his hand. "Let's get you something to eat, and then we'll figure out what comes next." As they walked away from the chaos, the weight of what had just happened settled on Mike's shoulders. This wasn't just about a single incident in a park. This was about something much bigger, and for better or worse, he knew he was now part of the fight. As Mike and Tasha walked away from Greenwood Park, the confrontation was still fresh in his mind. His steps were slow and deliberate, as each one carried the weight of the moment. The crowd had mostly dispersed, but the ripple effects were just beginning to take shape. Tasha glanced up at him, her wide eyes still tinged with fear. "Are they going to come after us?" she asked quietly. Mike stopped and crouched down to meet her gaze. "They won't touch you," he said firmly. "Not while I'm around. You don't have to worry about that." Her lips trembled as she nodded, but it was clear her trust in adults had been fractured. Mike felt a pang in his chest, a mix of anger at the system that had put her through this, and a fierce determination to make things right. "Come on," he said, standing up and taking her hand. "First, we're going to get you something to eat. Then, I'm going to make some calls." They found a small diner a few blocks away, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the early evening light. The place was nearly empty, save for a couple of patrons sipping coffee in the corner. Mike and Tasha slid into a booth, and a waitress with a kind face approached, her notepad in hand. "What can I get you?" she asked, her smile fading as she noticed Tasha's tear-streaked face. "2 burgers, 2 fries, and a milkshake for her," Mike said. "Vanilla, right?" he asked Tasha. She nodded hesitantly, her hand still clutching the hem of his hoodie. As the waitress walked away, Mike pulled out his phone. He hesitated for a moment, scrolling through his contacts before dialing a familiar number. The voice on the other end answered after the second ring. "Mike? What's going on, man?" It was Jay, an old friend and civil rights attorney who had spent years fighting cases like the one Mike now found himself in the middle of. If anyone could help him navigate the storm brewing, it was Jay. "I need your help," Mike said without preamble. "There was an incident at Greenwood Park today. A couple of cops went after a little girl and an old woman. It got ugly." "Define ugly," Jay said, his tone sharp. Mike sighed. "They tried to arrest the kid, threw the old lady to the ground. I stepped in." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Did they touch you?" "Number." "But I touched them." Jay let out a low whistle. "Man, you just can't keep yourself out of trouble, can you?" "It wasn't about me," Mike snapped. "This was wrong, Jay. People were filming. It's already all over social media. But I need to make sure those two, Tasha and Miss Helen, are protected. And I need to make sure those cops face the consequences." Jay's voice softened. "Okay, send me everything you've got. Videos, witness names, anything. I'll start pulling strings on my end." "And Mike?" "Yeah? Be careful. You know how this stuff goes. They're going to try to flip the narrative, make you the bad guy." Mike gritted his teeth. Let 'em try. By the time they left the diner, the streetlights had flickered on. Tasha clutched her milkshake like it was a lifeline, her steps quick to keep up with Mike's longer strides. When they reached the corner, Mike's phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at the screen. It was a news alert. "Greenwood Park incident. Mike Tyson intervenes in police altercation." He tapped the link, and a video began to play. It was the same footage that had gone viral earlier, but now it was accompanied by a voiceover painting a far more sanitized version of events. The reporter emphasized the dangerous escalation caused by civilian interference, barely acknowledging the actions of the officers. Mike's blood boiled. "Civilian interference?" he muttered, shoving the phone back in his pocket. That's what they're calling it? They're lying, aren't they? Tasha asked, her tiny voice cutting through the tension. Yeah, kid, Mike said. They're lying. The following day, Mike sat in his small apartment, scrolling through the flood of messages and notifications on his phone. Tasha was curled up on the couch, still asleep, her tiny frame bundled under one of his oversized blankets. A knock at the door startled him. He moved quickly, peering through the peephole before unlocking the door. It was Jay, looking as sharp as ever in a tailored suit and holding a briefcase. Got your message, he said, stepping inside, and I've got news. Mike gestured for him to sit, but Jay remained standing, his expression serious. Miss Helen gave a statement to the press this morning. Mike's eyebrows shot up. She did. What did she say? Jay pulled out his tablet and tapped a few times before handing it over. On the screen was a clip of Miss Helen, her arm in a sling but her voice steady. They thought they could get away with it, she said, her eyes fierce despite her frailty. But they didn't count on Mike Tyson being there. He didn't just stand up for me and that little girl. He stood up for everyone who's ever been pushed around by people with badges who think they're above the law. Mike felt a lump form in his throat as he watched. Miss Helen might have been old and injured, but her spirit was unbroken. She's a fighter, Jay said, taking the tablet back, but her statement's already stirring the pot. Some people are praising her. Others are accusing her of exaggerating what happened. Of course they are, Mike muttered, because it's easier to attack her than to admit the system's broken. Jay nodded. That's why we need to move fast. I've already reached out to a few media outlets. We're going to set up an interview for you. Mike's head snapped up. An interview? Yeah. You need to get ahead of this story before they spin it any further. Talk about what really happened, in your own words. Mike hesitated. He wasn't exactly comfortable with the idea of putting himself in the spotlight again, especially not for something like this. But then he thought of Tasha and Miss Helen. Of all the people who didn't have the platform, he did. Fine, he said finally. Set it up. By the afternoon, the story had reached a boiling point. News channels debated the footage endlessly. Social media platforms were flooded with posts both supporting and condemning Mike, and the police department issued a vague statement promising an internal investigation. Mike knew better than to put any faith in that. He also knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But as he watched Tasha sitting at his kitchen table, coloring quietly with a set of markers he'd picked up for her, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about what had happened in Greenwood Park. It was about challenging a system that had let it happen and making sure it didn't happen again. For the first time in years, Mike Tyson felt like he was back in the ring. Only this time, the fight wasn't against another boxer, and he wasn't planning to lose. The following day began with a storm of phone calls, reporters knocking on Mike's door, and the relentless hum of social media outrage. News vans lined the street outside his apartment complex, their antennas stretching into the sky like claws. Every outlet wanted a piece of Mike Tyson, the hero, the troublemaker, the fighter who had challenged the police in front of the world. Inside the apartment, Tasha sat cross-legged on the couch, her eyes darting toward the window every time a flashbulb popped. "Why are there so many people out there?" she asked. Mike, seated at the kitchen table with Jay, glanced toward the curtains he'd hastily pulled shut that morning. "They want a story," he said, "but they don't care about the truth." Jay looked up from his laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting off his glasses. "The truth is only half the battle, Mike. Perception is everything. And right now, they're trying to make you the villain." Mike leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest. "Let them. I've been called worse." "This isn't about you," Jay shot back, his tone sharper than usual. "It's about that little girl sitting right there and the millions of people like her who don't have your name or your resources. If they tear you down, they tear this whole fight down with you." Mike's jaw tightened. Jay was right, of course. This wasn't just about him. It never had been. Meanwhile, on the internet, the Greenwood Park incident had ignited a firestorm. Clips of the altercation circulated endlessly, accompanied by hashtags like #JusticeForTasha, #StandWithMike, and #EndPoliceBrutality. But as with any viral moment, there were also counter-narratives. Pundits on certain news networks painted Mike as a reckless vigilante, claiming he had escalated the situation and put the officers at risk. One particularly heated segment featured a panel of commentators debating the incident. "This isn't about race or injustice," one man argued, his voice dripping with hatred. "It's about a celebrity thinking he's above the law." "Above the law?" another panelist shot back. "He stopped two grown men from brutalizing a child and an elderly woman. What law are you defending exactly?" The clip spread like wildfire, further polarizing public opinion. The stakes were rising, and everyone involved knew it. That afternoon, as Mike was preparing for his first live interview, there was another knock at the door. He expected another reporter, or maybe even a protester. Instead, when he opened it, he found a man in a dark suit and tie, his expression grave. "Mr. Tyson," the man said, extending a hand. "Detective James Calloway, Internal Affairs." Mike's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" "I'm here about the officers from Greenwood Park," Calloway said. "May I come in?" Jay appeared in the doorway behind Mike, his arms crossed. "Anything you have to say, you can say in front of me. I'm his attorney." Calloway nodded, stepping inside. He glanced at Tasha, who quickly ducked behind the couch, then turned his attention back to Mike. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said. "The department is under a lot of heat right now. Those two officers, Blake and Carter, are already on administrative leave, but the public wants blood." "Good," Mike said flatly. "They deserve worse." Calloway's expression didn't change. "Maybe they do. But here's the thing. You're not exactly in the clear either. The police union is pushing back hard, claiming you interfered with an ongoing investigation." Mike let out a bitter laugh. "Investigation? They were beating up a little girl and an old lady. What were they investigating exactly?" Jay stepped in. "Detective Calloway, if you're here to threaten my client, I suggest you reconsider. Any further harassment will only add fuel to the fire." Calloway raised his hands defensively. "I'm not here to threaten anyone. I'm here because this situation is bigger than you think. The department is scrambling to control the narrative, and they're not above throwing you under the bus to do it." "So what do you want from me?" Mike asked. "I want to help," Calloway said, "but I need something in return." Mike crossed his arms, his gaze skeptical. "Help how?" Calloway hesitated, glancing toward Tasha before lowering his voice. "The footage from Greenwood Park only tells part of the story. Blake and Carter aren't just bad cops. They're tied to something much bigger. There's a network of officers in this city who cover for each other, falsify reports, and target vulnerable communities. If we can expose them, we can start cleaning house." "And what's my role in this?" Mike asked. "You're the catalyst," Calloway said. "People are paying attention because of who you are. If you're willing to speak out, not just about what happened in the park, but about the bigger picture, we might be able to force real change." Jay frowned. "That sounds like a lot of risk for my client with no guarantees." Calloway met Mike's eyes. "There are no guarantees. But if we don't do this, those officers will walk away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. And the next time this happens, there might not be someone like you around to stop it." Mike was silent for a long moment, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He thought about Tasha, who was still hiding behind the couch, and Miss Helen, who had risked everything to speak out. He thought about his childhood, the times he'd felt powerless against a system that seemed designed to crush people like him. Finally, he spoke. "I'll do it, but only if you promise me one thing." "What's that?" Calloway asked. "You take down every single one of them," Mike said. "Blake, Carter, they're buddies. Anyone who thinks they can get away with this. No deals, no compromises." Calloway nodded. "You have my word." As soon as Calloway left, the room fell into a tense silence. Jay paced back and forth, clearly agitated. "I hope you know what you're doing, Mike. This isn't just a fight. It's a war, and they're going to come after you with everything they've got." Mike shrugged. "Let them. I've been in wars before." "This is different," Jay said. "They're not just going to come for you. They're going to come for your past, your reputation, everything you've ever done. Are you ready for that?" Mike glanced over at Tasha, who had finally come out from behind the couch and was now watching him with wide, worried eyes. He crouched down in front of her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "What do you think, kid? Should we fight?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, we should fight." Mike smiled. "Then that's what we're going to do." The following morning, Mike Tyson found himself seated across from the most high-profile journalist in the country. The set was blindingly bright, with lights and cameras pointed directly at him as if they were ready to dissect every word that came out of his mouth. Jay sat just off camera, arms crossed, silently willing Mike to stay calm and stick to the plan. On the other side of the table sat Lisa Romero, a seasoned interviewer known for her strict, no-nonsense approach. She shuffled her notes, her expression unreadable, before looking up at Mike. "Mr. Tyson, you've been called many things over the years. Legend, fighter, and, more recently, troublemaker. Let's cut to the chase. Why did you intervene at Greenwood Park, and what do you say to those accusing you of escalating the situation?" Mike leaned forward, his massive hands resting on the table. "I didn't escalate anything," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I stopped two men with badges from beating a defenseless little girl and an elderly woman. If that's trouble, then yeah, I'm trouble." Lisa's eyebrow arched slightly, but she didn't miss a beat. "Some critics argue that you could have handled the situation differently, perhaps by calling 911 instead of confronting the officers directly. What do you say to that?" Mike let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. 911? You think the same system that sent those two cops would have saved Tasha? Number, I've been around long enough to know when it's time to act. If I didn't step in, who would have? The people filming with their phones? The ones shouting from a distance? Somebody had to do something. Lisa nodded, acknowledging his point. Fair enough. But now, your actions have placed you at the center of a national debate. Police unions are calling for your arrest. Protesters are rallying in your name. And the footage from that day has turned into a political lightning rod. Are you prepared for what comes next? Mike glanced at Jay, who gave him the slightest nod of encouragement. Then, he turned back to Lisa. I didn't ask for this, but I'm not running from it either. This isn't just about me, or even about Tasha and Miss Helen. It's about a system that keeps letting this happen, and if I have to be the one to call it out, then so be it. As the interview aired, the reactions were immediate and explosive. Supporters flooded social media with messages of praise and solidarity, sharing hashtags like Iron Mike for Justice and organizing rallies across the country. But the backlash was just as fierce. Law enforcement officials held press conferences, accusing Mike of obstructing justice and endangering the officers on the scene. Blake and Carter's lawyers released a statement claiming the officers were responding to a credible tip about a stolen item and that their actions were misinterpreted in the heat of the moment. One particularly controversial headline from a major news network read, "Mike Tyson, Hero or Menace." At the same time, the protests increased. Crowds gathered outside police precincts, waving signs that read, "No justice, no peace," and chanting Tasha's name. At the largest rally, Tasha herself stood on a stage next to Miss Helen and Mike, her tiny voice increased by a microphone. "They called me a thief," she said, her hands trembling as she held the mic. "They said I didn't belong in the park, but I was doing nothing wrong. I just wanted to play on the swings." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Mike noticed tears streaming down Miss Helen's face as she wrapped an arm around Tasha. For every cheer, there was a reminder of the pain and trauma this fight had caused. While the public battle raged on, Detective Calloway worked tirelessly behind the scenes. He uncovered damning evidence that Blake and Carter had falsified reports on multiple occasions, targeting individuals in marginalized communities under the guise of routine patrols. Calloway also discovered connections to a shadowy network within the department known as the Brotherhood, a group of officers who operated above the law, protecting each other at all costs. Blake and Carter were low-level enforcers, but the deeper Calloway dug, the more dangerous the situation became. One evening, Calloway met with Mike and Jay in a diner on the outskirts of town. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot and his suit wrinkled, but his determination hadn't wavered. "They're panicking," Calloway said, sliding a folder across the table to Mike. They know we're onto them, and they're starting to cover their tracks. Mike opened the folder, his eyes scanning the grainy photographs and confidential documents inside. What am I looking at? Proof, Calloway said. Blake and Carter didn't just target Tasha by chance. They were acting on orders from someone higher up. The Brotherhood wanted to send a message. Keep certain people out of certain spaces. Jay frowned. You mean they were targeting the park specifically? Calloway nodded. Greenwood Park is a symbol. It's one of the few places in this city where everyone's supposed to feel welcome, no matter their background. But to the Brotherhood, it's a territory they want to control. And anyone who doesn't fit their image of belonging becomes a target. Mike's fists clenched. So this ain't just about two bad cops. It's the whole damn system. Exactly, Calloway said. And if we're going to take it down, we need to be smart. The Brotherhood has allies in high places. Judges, politicians, and even some of the media. The war became all too real later that night. As Mike was leaving the diner, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up beside him. The window rolled down just enough for a man in a ski mask to lean out. Stay out of it, Tyson, the man growled. You don't know who you're messing with. Before Mike could react, the SUV sped off, its tires screeching against the pavement. When Mike returned to his apartment, Jay was waiting for him, pacing anxiously. You okay? Jay asked, noticing the tension in Mike's shoulders. They tried to scare me, Mike said, his voice low. But it ain't gonna work. Jay sighed. Mike, you need to be careful. These people aren't playing games. If they feel cornered, they won't just come after you. They'll come after everyone you care about. Mike nodded, his mind already racing. He thought of Tasha, Miss Helen, Jay, and even Calloway. He couldn't let his fight put them in danger, but he also couldn't back down. Not now, not when the truth was finally within reach. The warning didn't scare Mike. It infuriated him. For every step forward they'd made, the opposition seemed ready to push back harder. But this wasn't the boxing ring. This was the real world, where corruption didn't fight fair. Still, Mike knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Tasha or anyone else become a victim again. A week later, Mike sat in a car with Detective Calloway and Jay. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was tense as they prepared to meet with a key informant. Calloway had arranged the meeting in an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, far away from prying eyes and ears. This guy's risking everything, Calloway said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He's been part of the Brotherhood for years. If he's willing to talk, it could be the break we need. Mike stared out the window, his jaw tight. You sure he's not setting us up? Calloway hesitated before responding. I've vetted him as much as I can. But yeah, there's always a risk. That's why we're doing this quietly. As they pulled up to the warehouse, the scene felt like something out of a crime drama. The building was old, its windows shattered, and its walls covered in graffiti. The faint glow of a single streetlight cast long, eerie shadows across the lot. The three men stepped out of the car, their footsteps echoing as they approached the entrance. Inside, the informant, a thin man in his late 40s with a nervous energy, was already waiting. You're late, he hissed, glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. We're here now, Calloway said, his tone firm. Let's get to it. What do you have for us? The informant handed over a flash drive. Everything you need. Emails, memos, even recordings. The Brotherhood's been running this city like a private club for years. They've got dirt on everyone. Judges, cops, even the mayor. That's how they stay untouchable. Mike took a step closer, his towering presence making the man shrink back slightly. Why now? Why are you helping us? The informant swallowed hard. Because they're losing control. After what happened at the park, the public is finally paying attention. If someone doesn't expose them, they'll burn the whole city down to protect themselves. Before anyone could respond, the sound of tires screeching outside shattered the tense silence. Calloway's eyes widened. It's a trap. We've got to move. Gunfire erupted as masked men poured into the warehouse, their weapons aimed directly at the group. Mike grabbed the informant, pulling him behind a stack of crates as bullets ricocheted off the concrete walls. Calloway returned fire, his aim precise, while Jay scrambled to shield himself behind a metal beam. "Mike, we need to get out of here!" Jay shouted over the chaos. Mike scanned the room, his fighter's instincts kicking in. He spotted a back exit and motioned to the others. "This way! Go!" With the informant in tow, they made a break for it, dodging bullets as they ran. Mike was the last to leave, covering their escape with a strength and determination that seemed almost superhuman. By the time they reached safety, it was clear the ambush wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration of war. Calloway's car was riddled with bullet holes, and the informant was shaking like a leaf. "They're not going to stop," the informant stammered, clutching the flash drive like it was a lifeline. "You don't understand. These people don't just kill you. They ruin you first. They make sure no one remembers your name." Mike placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "They can try, but they're not going to win. Not this time." Jay, still catching his breath, turned to Calloway. "We've got the evidence now. We need to go public before they bury us." Calloway nodded. "Agreed, but we have to be smart about this. The Brotherhood's reach is deep, and if we don't handle this carefully, they'll spin it in their favor." Mike's voice was steady but persistent. "Then we go all in. No more hiding, no more playing it safe. We take this fight to them, and we don't stop until they're finished." The next morning, Mike held a press conference on the steps of City Hall. The crowd was massive, and a sea of supporters were holding signs that read, "Justice for Tasha" and "End Police Corruption." Tasha stood by his side, her small hand clutching his as she stared out at the crowd. Miss Helen was there too, her frail frame dwarfed by the presence of the towering fighter. When Mike stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent. His voice boomed through the speakers, raw with emotion. "I'm not a politician. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a man who saw something wrong and couldn't walk away," he began. "But this isn't just about me. This is about every kid like Tasha, every person like Miss Helen, who's been told they don't matter. It's about a system that's broken and a fight we all have to join." He held up the flash drive. "This right here, this is the truth they've been hiding. Proof of corruption, abuse, and a system that protects the guilty while punishing the innocent. And today, we're putting it all on the table." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Mike's expression remained serious. "This fight isn't going to be easy. They're going to come at us with everything they've got, but we're stronger together. And if they think we're backing down, they've got another thing coming." As the crowd roared, Mike glanced down at Tasha, who smiled up at him with admiration. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. But the Brotherhood wasn't about to go down quietly. Within hours of the press conference, smear campaigns flooded the media. Headlines accused Mike of being a vigilante, a washed-up boxer looking for relevance. Calloway faced mounting pressure from his department, while Jay's business began receiving anonymous threats. Even Miss Helen found herself harassed by unknown callers, their voices dripping with menace. And yet, none of it deterred them. If anything, it only strengthened their resolve. 2 days after the press conference, the city transformed. What began as small pockets of outrage snowballed into a full-blown movement. People from all walks of life, students, parents, activists, and even some lawmakers, banded together under a single cause: accountability. The slogan, "Justice for Tasha," became a rallying cry. Plastered across posters, hashtags, and even graffiti scrawled on city walls. In the heart of the city, Freedom Plaza became the epicenter of the movement. Mike Tyson was at the center of it all, not just as a figurehead, but as a relentless advocate for change. The stakes were higher than ever, and he knew the pressure would only mount from here. Mike stood in his small kitchen early that morning, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. His mind raced as he reviewed his speech one last time. Across the table sat Jay, scrolling through his phone with excitement. "You've seen this?" Jay asked, turning the screen toward Mike. A viral video showed clips of the park incident, spliced with footage of Mike's press conference. It was trending everywhere. "Iron Mike fights injustice," Jay read aloud. "People are calling you a modern-day folk hero, man." Mike shook his head. "This isn't about me. It's about Tasha, about all the people who've been wronged. I'm just someone who got tired of staying quiet. Jay leaned back, his expression softening. That's why people are listening. You're real, Mike, and that scares them. Before Mike could respond, Tasha shuffled into the room, still in her pajamas. Her tiny frame made her presence almost ghost-like, but her voice was firm. "Are you going to tell them about the mean cops?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. Mike crouched to meet her gaze. "I'm going to tell them the truth. All of it." Tasha nodded solemnly, then reached up to hug him. "Don't let them win." "I won't," Mike promised. The gathering crowd. By mid-afternoon, Freedom Plaza was packed. Thousands of people held signs with phrases like, "End police brutality," "Justice for Tasha," and "Accountability now." Families brought their children. Young people live-streamed the event, and local news crews scrambled to cover every angle. Near the stage, Miss Helen sat in a wheelchair, a blanket draped over her lap. Despite the weight of recent events, her eyes sparkled with a quiet determination. "I haven't seen anything like this since the Black Lives Matter movement," she whispered to Jay, who stood beside her. Calloway joined them, his usual stoicism softened by the sheer energy of the crowd. "This isn't just about one incident," he said, almost to himself. "This is a reckoning." When Mike finally stepped up to the microphone, the roar of the crowd was deafening. He raised a hand to quiet them, his face a mask of both gratitude and resolve. "Thank you," he began, his deep voice carrying over the plaza. "Thank you for being here, for standing up, and for saying, 'Enough is enough.'" He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. 2 weeks ago, I watched a little girl get hurt by the very people who were supposed to protect her. I saw an old woman get thrown to the ground like she didn't matter. And I saw a system that didn't care. But what I also saw was something they didn't expect. Mike gestured toward the crowd. "I saw all of you. People who decided that enough was enough. People who decided to fight back, not with violence, but with unity. And that scares them, because when we stand together, we're unstoppable." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Mike held up his hand again, his tone growing somber. "This fight isn't just about Tasha or Miss Helen or me. It's about every person who's ever felt powerless. It's about holding those in power accountable for their actions. And it's about fixing a system that's broken." He stepped back from the microphone for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then he leaned forward, his voice low but fierce. "They want us to give up, to stay silent, to let them get away with it. But we won't, because we know the truth, and we're not afraid to fight for it." The crowd's applause was deafening, but it was silenced when a small, hesitant voice echoed through the speakers. "Excuse me," Tasha said, standing on stage beside Mike. She held the microphone with both hands, her small frame dwarfed by the podium. The audience held its breath as she spoke. "My name is Tasha, and I just want to say thank you. Thank you for helping me, and for helping other kids like me." Her voice trembled, but she continued. "I was really scared that day, but Mr. Mike helped me. And now, you're all helping me too. So, thank you." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd as she handed the microphone back to Mike, who placed a protective hand on her shoulder. The rally lasted well into the evening, with speeches from community leaders, activists, and even former police officers who had come forward to condemn the corruption within the force. By the time the crowd began to disperse, the movement had taken on a life of its own. Social media exploded with footage from the rally, and the hashtag number Justice for Tasha trended worldwide. Donations poured in to support legal efforts, community programs, and advocacy groups. But the most powerful moment came when a group of uniformed officers, men and women who had grown tired of the corruption around them, stepped forward to join the movement. One of them, a young officer named Martinez, addressed the crowd. "I became a cop to protect people, not hurt them. And I refuse to stand by and watch while my badge is used as a shield for injustice." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Mike nodded approvingly. This was what he had been fighting for. Not just justice for Tasha, but real, systemic change. But not everyone was celebrating. Behind closed doors, the Brotherhood watched the rally with growing unease. Their power was slipping, and they knew it. "This Tyson guy," one of them growled, slamming a fist on the table. "He's a problem. We need to shut him down. Now." Their leader, a cold, calculating man known only as Boss, leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Patience," he said softly. "The louder they get, the harder they'll fall. Let them have their little rally. It won't matter when we remind them who really runs this city." As Mike left the rally that night, surrounded by supporters and reporters, he couldn't help but feel a sense of both pride and apprehension. The movement was growing, but so were the stakes. "You did good today," Jay said as they climbed into the car. Mike glanced out the window at the crowds of people still chanting in the streets. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Tasha, sitting in the back seat, leaned forward. "But we're winning, right?" Mike turned to her, his expression softening. "We're not done fighting, kid. But yeah, we're winning." The Brotherhood was cornered. The rally had shaken their foundation, exposing cracks in their iron grip. For the first time, they felt the tide turning, and they were determined to strike back. The counterattack began with whispers and rumors, subtle, calculated moves to discredit Mike and his growing coalition. Leaked documents, doctored photos, and paid-off media personalities painted him as a violent agitator with a questionable past. One morning, Jay stormed into Mike's gym with a tablet in hand. "Have you seen this?" he shouted, tossing it onto the bench. Mike picked it up, staring at the headline. "Iron Mike's Iron Fist. Is he leading a mob?" Below it was a blurry photo of him at the rally, doctored to make it look like he was shouting angrily at police officers. "This is just the beginning," Jay said, pacing back and forth. "They're pulling out all the stops. TV, blogs, social media. They're trying to paint you as a criminal." Mike set the tablet down, his jaw tightening. "Let them," he said calmly. "The truth is on our side. If they want to play dirty, we'll play smart." Mike and his team quickly launched a counteroffensive of their own. Jay mobilized their growing network of supporters, who flooded social media with the unedited footage of the rally, debunking the Brotherhood's propaganda. Calloway worked with investigative journalists to expose the Brotherhood's tactics, revealing how they manipulated the media to maintain control. But the most significant blow came from Miss Helen. The retired teacher had quietly been collecting stories from others who had suffered under the Brotherhood's rule. A single mother who lost her home to corrupt bank practices. A young man wrongly imprisoned on fabricated charges. Small business owners crushed under exorbitant fees and protection payments. Miss Helen organized these stories into a powerful video montage, which quickly went viral. The title, "Voices of the Silenced," struck a chord with millions. It wasn't just about Tasha anymore. It was about everyone who the system had wronged. Frustrated by their failed smear campaign, the Brotherhood escalated their attacks. Late one night, Mike's gym was broken into and trashed. Equipment was destroyed, walls were spray-painted with threatening messages, and the security cameras were mysteriously disabled. The following day, as Mike surveyed the damage, Jay found a small black envelope taped to the front door. Inside was a simple message: "Stand down, or everyone you love will pay." Jay's hands shook as he read it. "These guys aren't playing, Mike. They're becoming serious." Mike folded the note and tucked it into his pocket. "So are we." The flash drive from the informant at the old house was damning. The evidence included illegal activities, bribery, racketeering, and even ties to violent crime. With this information, Mike's team approached federal investigators. The evidence was too substantial to ignore, and soon, a federal task force was assembled to investigate the Brotherhood. At the same time, Mike decided to address the threats publicly. Standing outside his vandalized gym, he spoke to reporters. "They think they can scare me into silence," he said, holding up the black envelope. "They think they can intimidate us into backing down. But all they've done is prove why we need to keep fighting. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us, and we're not going anywhere." The broadcast went viral, galvanizing public support even further. As the federal investigation gained momentum, more whistleblowers came forward, emboldened by Mike's bravery. The Brotherhood's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. In a shocking turn of events, Officer Martinez, the young cop who had spoken out at the rally, provided critical testimony. He revealed how the Brotherhood had infiltrated the police force, using it as a tool to suppress dissent and protect their interests. Martinez's revelations led to a series of high-profile arrests, including several senior police officials. The city was rocked as the extent of the corruption came to light. With the Brotherhood weakened, Mike and his coalition seized the moment to push for systemic reform. They demanded a complete overhaul of the current police transparency laws. The movement's momentum was unstoppable. City officials, under immense public pressure, began implementing these reforms. 6 months after the rally, the city held a special election to replace several corrupt officials. Mike was urged to run for office, but he declined. "This was never about me," he said in an interview. "This was about the people, about giving them a voice." Miss Helen, now a respected community leader, summed it up best during a televised panel discussion. "What we did was more than take down a corrupt system. We built something better in its place." The Brotherhood was dismantled, and its leaders imprisoned or disgraced. The city began to heal. One evening, Mike stood on the steps of his rebuilt gym, watching as kids from the neighborhood sparred and laughed inside. Tasha, now more confident than ever, ran up to him. "Mr. Mike," she said, tugging at his sleeve, "do you think the bad guys are gone for good?" Mike knelt to meet her gaze. "The bad guys are always around, kid, but as long as we stick together, they don't stand a chance." Tasha smiled, then ran back inside to join the others. As Mike looked out at the city, he felt a sense of peace. The fight wasn't over. It never truly would be, but for now, they had won. And that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing. I put a lot of time into crafting these heartfelt narratives, and your support means the world. Thank you for being part of this journey.